Hello. All right. The next major topic for your MCAS application is going to be your research experience. So, as you take classes at whatever university you're at, you'll be exposed to a lot of different topics. And what I found is that a lot of classes tend to be a little bit boring. And what's a lot more interesting, um, to a biochemist speaking, or I'm not a biochemist, but I at least study biochemistry, um, is I like looking at literature. I like looking at studies themselves. That's a lot more interesting to me than slide deck or slideshow. And what you can do is take the topics that you're introduced to in lecture and then go out of your way to research those topics that are somewhat interesting. Maybe they're really interesting. And take a look at the literature and see what you think of it. If you like the literature, pretty much every university has like a faculty registry and look for professors who do research in what you're interested in. Once you find a list of professors, write up a cold email, which we have a template for right here in italics, and send it to them and see what they respond. So the basics of the template, just so you don't have to read all of this, is who you are, how you came across their profile, um, what you're interested in, why you want to join their research lab, how it'll be beneficial to you, and how it'll be beneficial to the PI. PI is the lead professor of the lab. And you fire them off a couple times. You test out, hopefully in some interviews, what they're like, what the lab environment is like. And just because you're offered a position does not mean that you have to immediately say yes. You want to be in a place that promotes your growth and your learning so that you can ultimately contribute to the scientific field that you're interested in. For example, if the lab environment is very much hands-off uh, from the graduate or scientist and is very much placing individuality, uh, independence in the hands of the undergraduate, and you are just really lost in what's going on, then that's probably not a good fit for you. Now, that's not necessarily a bad mentorship style, but it just might not be the right mentorship style for you. On the other spectrum, maybe you join a lab that's way, way too organized and it can feel maybe like asphyxiating, where you have to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, F, G at deadlines 2, 3, and 4. And then you're just like, uh, there's way too much going on. And that can be bad for you. So you need to figure out what works for you and what doesn't work. Be wary of commitments because if you join a lab and they say you need a minimum of a 2-year commitment, that's a long commitment. But it's not going to look so good for you to then be part of the lab for like a month and then drop out. Um, some labs are nice and they offer like a trial period. Take advantage of those. What else? Okay, I would suggest get involved in research as soon as possible. Um, I'm not a proponent of waiting until you've done your heavier classes to be involved in research. You don't need to do that. Um, Also, if you start earlier, you're just going to develop more relationships with faculty earlier, and ultimately, you will be learning real science sooner, so that when you are a junior and that when you are a senior, you're going to crush your research experience. Maybe you'll end up in a publication, um, or maybe more. Maybe you go present your findings at a conference, etc. That is going to be easier if you start doing research earlier. The major purpose of these big research universities is exactly that. It's research. Um, just because maybe you don't have the class experience does not put you at a major disadvantage for applying to a lot of these laboratory positions. Because from the PI's perspective, the younger you are, the more data you can get for the lab. And with data, then you can move on to more experiments, and make more papers, etc. So don't be intimidated by perhaps your youth. And it might be a little bit intimidating to reach out to these professors. That's why I actually kind of like this cold email approach, is because you don't have to confront them face to face immediately. Um, it's kind of like DMing a random person on Instagram. There's a bit of that barrier of anonymity um, to get your foot in the door. Um, Sometimes the PI might miss your email. It's okay to send a polite follow-up email. But if they're just not responding, then you probably have to set your sights on a new research lab. So another thing I want to touch on before I close out this video is why is research so important from the perspective of a med school admissions officer? And that's because research forces you to think at a higher level. It forces you to do your own independent studies, come up with your own ideas, learn a bunch of things that aren't familiar to you. So like different protocols, etc. It requires extensive planning. Um, it requires aspects of teamwork, so getting information from different experts in your field. And ultimately, it requires you to analyze data so that you can move forward for your next experiment. And these are all facets of higher order thinking that are not easily demonstrable in your general classes. And that type of higher level thinking is crucial for somebody going into an advanced degree, be it PhD, MD, DO, etc. If you're able to demonstrate that higher level thinking, you are more likely to make a major contribution to that institution, which makes you inherently more appealing to the admissions officer. And yeah, that'll wrap up our segment on research. Next, we will be touching clinical experience. All right. Thank you very much for joining.